I'm Melody Russell. You're watching Asked and Answered.
BC, AD, that type of thing. There's also another demarcation amongst Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants. I shouldn't say one demarcation, there's several that most people don't know about. And I'm hoping that Alice will jump in and supplement my question. But, maybe you can talk about how Executive Order 9066 affects the different perspectives based on Nisei, Issei, and the other generational demarcation.
James or Alice, what do you have in mind in terms of there's this primary demarcation of camp, of the Japanese American concentration camps, and a lot of social fallout in different ways around what happened to the Japanese American community. But it's sort of, social history of Japanese Americans, which is, of course, an important story. So did you have something in mind?
Okay, so yeah, let me be very specific. Yeah, let me give more context. As we've started to prepare for the MCLE, which is proving to be quite a thing. And we've started talking to people, right? And you realize in terms of Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants, different stages, completely different perspectives. Like, say, for a person who's come and moved to the United States from Japan in the 90s, has a completely different perspective from, say, someone whose family's, been here for 100 decades, right? Or, you know what I mean? And then even within, say, like, for instance, we talk about Alice's family, her parents came over, I believe, after World War II. I'll let her sort of talk about it, but we've had a conversation where there's just a subset of how Japanese culture or Japanese, what the Japanese American experience is. For instance, and I will let Alice has a different perspective on her particular demarcation than her brothers and sisters, and clearly her mother and father. So if you could expound on that, Alice.
Yeah. So I'm Nisei. And my parents came here in 1970. And so it's very interesting. I love having conversations with other Japanese Americans, even listening to you today, because, the ancestral line, even though it's all going back to Japan, like, my grandfather was actually in the military fighting against the Americans during World War II. Well, he was a postal worker, but my point is he's on the other side, right? And so my family grew up, or my parents grew up during the Battle of Okinawa. So it's a very different historical lineage. And so then we all end up here, we're all classified as Japanese Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But I find that the historical, the story itself is very different. Because as you grew up with camp, you grew up with your parents being put there. And then I grew up with stories of, like, what the Battle of Okinawa did and how it decimated 75% of the population in Okinawa, right? And then the whole story about the bases being in Okinawa. And so it's just really interesting, because I feel like, even though we're both, you're Nisei, right, Neil?
No. Okay. And I'll respond to that in a moment, but go ahead.
Okay.
Third generation.
Right. Okay. But it's so interesting, because I feel like, as I can tell, your history, your life history and your family history really informs who you are and how you see the world. Yeah, so it's just interesting about how both of us, even though we both are Japanese American and both of us, our ancestors have come from Japan, that our life stories and the historical viewpoint is so vastly different. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Okay, so a couple of points. First, historically, Issei, Nisei, Sansei, and to a lesser extent, Yonsei. These are actually conditioned by the American history of immigration and racial exclusion. So Japanese immigration, as a complement to other Asian immigration, until the 1924 National Origins Act passed by Congress, which included Japanese exclusion as a part of it, cut off Japanese immigration. So my grandparents came from Japan until, and that generation came until 1924, with Japanese exclusion. And there's a whole separate legal history to exclusion versus quotas. That meant that families, essentially, the ability to immigrate and have families essentially ended at that moment. So that's the Issei generation, those Japanese who came up to and including up to exclusion in 1924. Their children then became Nisei, that is to say, the children of that first wave of immigrants. And because of the particular historicity of the cutoff ended here in 1920, immigration ended here, it's an identifiable generational group, and they were Nisei. That was then the political meaning within the community was then reinforced, is not the right word, reinforced with a sledgehammer in the camps. Because the Issei, the Japanese immigrants, were also barred from becoming US citizens. Whereas the Nisei generation, by being born here, were automatically citizens under Wong Kim Ark, just to make an obscure reference to the legal literature. So there was an automatic generational divide imposed by the law, by racial exclusion to citizenship, as well as a natural generational cutoff created by the 1924 Act. So that then in camp was exacerbated because I mentioned there was a roundup and internment and jailing of most of the immigrant leadership. The organizations that were left were Japanese Americans, the Nisei generation, who were just beginning to come into their own and had formed their own community organization, the Japanese American Citizens League. Now, you don't call yourself a citizen without knowing full well that your parents' generation were barred from becoming citizens. And then in camp itself, this was made worse by a loyalty oath. So as part of the question of, well, should Japanese be allowed to serve in the military? And there was a major political effort in Hawaii to say, well, we should be able to at least serve in the military and fight in Europe. And this ended up in the 442nd and these really, among Japanese Americans, well-known Japanese American regiments. These were segregated regiments with white leadership, white officer leadership, who fought in Europe and including participation in the opening of some of the Jewish concentration camps as part of their war effort. So as part of this idea about, well, in order to recruit people, we need a loyalty oath. And so what was presented to everyone, to all the everyone in the camps, but in of particular interest to the males, was two questions. One was, do you forswear allegiance to the Japanese Empire? And the corollary, do you then swear allegiance to the United States government? The problem for the Issei was, if you forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor, you would be essentially rendered stateless because they couldn't become American citizens. And so the alternative was the ability to say yes carried with it the possibility that they, if the war, by the time the war ended, they would become stateless citizens because they would have withdrawn their Japanese citizenship and were barred from becoming American citizens. This created enormous dislocations. A number of the No-No Boy, John O'Connor's novel called The No-No Boy, is about some of the fallout from this. The Japanese American Citizens League supported this effort, essentially, the loyalty oaths, which of course created this incredible political division between Issei and Nisei within the camps. And many of the Japanese who then said no, the Issei, were one entire shipload, thousands were sent back to Japan, and thousands more were ready to be sent back to Japan after the end of World War II. In other words, after the end of the war, because they had signed this loyalty oath in the incorrect manner, were to be deported back to Japan and were stopped only by the intervention several really quite amazing white American attorneys. And I'm never going to forgive myself because I'm blanking on his name. He's sort of like, he was participating in the Korematsu case. He took Korematsu's case when the Japanese American Citizens League wouldn't take up the issue. It was the ACLU and...
Yeah, I think you're talking about Earl Warren.
No.
Not Earl Warren?
No. Anyway, I'll remember
later
after it's too late. Well, I'll have it ready for if we do the one on Japanese Americans. But this is sort of the long version of Issei Nisei. Sansei then were born after World War II, my generation. And the delineation sort of by that then falls apart, because by the time you get to the 60s, with the 1965 immigration law, which then opened up immigration. And so most immigration from Asia, the people we talk about being Asian Americans, there's the pre-65 immigrant generation and children's generations born here, and then post-65. And that's the modern dividing line in terms of community. So finally, a theoretical point. In my work on Asian Americans and on Asian Americans, one of the points that I make, and one of the theoretical distinctions I make, is about identity. And Anthony Appia, the scholar, has written about identity. He divides it up into three dimensions, actually. There is collective identity, which is the identity that groups choose for themselves. There is the imposed identity, which is imposed by society. And then there are what he calls identification projects. That is to say, when a community decides they want to create and produce an identity, that's an identification project. So, fast forward, anti-Asian violence. This is an identity imposed by society. You look a certain way, you have a certain body type, so it makes you subject to violence. Now, for many Asian Americans, for many people of Asian ancestry, it's kind of like, wait a minute, I'm Korean, I'm Japanese, I'm Japanese American, I'm Chinese American. What is this Asian stuff about? Because there's nothing in the community life of the collective identification projects, the churches, the social organizations, the various kinds of social groupings, to necessarily make you an Asian American. But the imposed identity of the anti-Asian violence is, no, this is a racial category. You're going to be subject, you are subject to violence, doesn't matter whether you like it or not. So this question of what identity and community is a complex one, and it's not one-sided. It's very important to understand the social racial dimensions as distinct from the community identification, community identity and identification projects. And of course, for an individual, that becomes a really complicated question of like, what am I choosing? Who am I supposed to be in this incredibly complicated racial context? So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very, very fascinating. I'm just curious though, then to follow up. So you explained very succinctly and very well the Issei Nisei Sansei lineage with according to the laws that were being passed.
Right.
So then what are the, like, I'm post 1965, right? So my parents came in 1970. So then how does, like, what are the labels that we put on in terms of generation? Do we just go back to English and say they're just the immigrants and then I'm first generation? Like, what are the generational labels that get put on to the post 1965 people?
It's a work in progress. And in fact, we are in the process of inventing these various labels and considerations. In other words, I saw a headline go by of an article about, I was Korean American, and now I'm an Asian American. And so it's kind of like, no, this is what's going on right now, is this complex process in which Asian American is being reinvented and reimposed in a different way from the invention of the Asian American in the 60s as a political movement. That was when Asian Americans, persons of Asian ancestry who wanted to create a political identity for themselves, joined together in Asian American political movements, notably in the student strikes of at San Francisco State and the various universities and colleges around the country. But this current moment is one in which, no, this is about violence. This is about the most important means of racial subordination, lynchings and violence. And of course, this is the history of Black America. Violence is the primary means of subordination. And it's imposed upon invented racial groups. You have to invent race to be able to find a target for the violence. But we have a 400-year history for Black Americans, and a much more recent for Asian Americans, and something in between for Mexican, Latino populations, Latinx populations. And of course, if Asian Americans have difficulty figuring out what the label is, there's an extraordinarily interesting, vibrant discussion going on now about Latina, Latino, Latinx, Latin crosshatch, Latin, various formulations about what the label should be, what it means in terms of collective identities, and various groupings. So that's my racial formation shtick.
I'm really glad to hear you talk about the whole Asian American versus Japanese American, because I've had this conversation with James before, and I was like, I don't understand this Asian American because I'm like Japanese American, and I'm very, very different from Korean American and Chinese American, Vietnamese American. And so I'm really glad that that's like, a larger debate and discussion, and that it's not just something that I'm feeling. I'm grateful for that. Yeah, and then specifically Okinawan American, right? Because there's a very different. Both of my parents were from Okinawa, and they always had like negative feelings towards mainland Japanese, which I did not understand when I was growing up until when I started researching the history of Okinawa and mainland Japanese, and was able to understand. Oh, okay, they're also thought of as a second-class citizen, treated as such many times in history, particularly during World War II. And so, like the identities are definitely different. So lumping us all in and imposing Asian American definitely makes me bristle a little bit.
Well, yes. I mean, this is, and this is what this last round, this most recent round of anti-Asian violence has been anti-Asian, quite specifically. And how, reacting to it has been quite complex. And the reactions to it have been quite, from an academic point of view, quite interesting as to how communities are trying to respond.
Thanks everyone for watching Asked and Answered. If you like this series, if you like what you've seen and what you've heard, smash that like button and subscribe.